And thank you for coming out. I appreciate this on this St. Patrick's Day, especially the O'Connell side of my family. My mom's family in the mid-19th century, one of the millions coming from Ireland to America, part of that. Now, I had no green until Beth came in with this, and so thank you, Beth, for at least making me a little bit on this. So I do appreciate it. Aside from St. Nicholas, St. Patrick is the second best known saint, and this day is the day in which we commemorate his death in 461. But, and I think it's important to set up beforehand, things such as the dates of his death and birth, 375, also other dates in which he was part of his missionary journey. They are not all absolutely nailed down. There is consensus. And so too some other parts of it. But it's important to realize the meta-narrative, the big picture of who St. Patrick was, his impact for Christ in Ireland and Europe, and his impact of the Celtic revival on Europe in the Western civilization is not anything that we can doubt. Those are all facts. So I just think that's important as we set up and talk about him. Now, probably like me, when you were thinking of St. Pat like that would be maybe this day. Or probably never thought of the teenager, Patrick, which we'll talk about. But this cartoon character is more typically what people think about St. Patrick. And what we've seen is we have this very important person who has this unbelievable impact on Western civilization turned into a caricature. And we're all familiar with those.
Tis the first green of spring. See Frosty Fake Shamrock Shakes and new Shamrock Sundays with mint-flavored topping. Get everybody in the spirit.
Your Irish eyes are smiling no matter who you are. Nobody can do it like McDonald's can.
So, the real holiday, right? Isn't that what we've all done in Western culture, despite who he is? I like to call St. Patrick the most unknown known person who is around. So I think it's important to start with we'll start with three things that St. Patrick wasn't. And he wasn't Irish, he wasn't a snake chaser, and he wasn't a Roman Catholic. Now, notice the asterisk on the Roman Catholic. We're going to talk about that issue. Certainly, the Roman Catholic Church has embraced him and made him their own. But as we look at Celtic Christianity and what happened at that time, I think that's a fascinating part of it. But his story really starts, and you have to have the context of the Roman Empire, because his life, especially his adult life, was exactly during the time in which the Roman Empire was falling. And that plays into his importance in what he was. And you think this is now 400 AD, and you look, and this is the most expansive part of it. From North Africa across, of course, we know in biblical times, in the times of Christ, the Roman Empire, very influential. And then up through Europe, east and west, and you'll see even to Britain. You'll notice where it is not. It's not in Ireland. They didn't want to go there, and we'll talk about that. But the British Empire, nonetheless, was a large one, lasted about 1,000 years. And his story really does start there. And the disintegration of the Roman Empire was certainly underway when he was born and while he grew up. And as we learn more about him, we'll see the impact he had because of the fall of the Roman Empire. And so let's look at that. It was a slow fall, but nonetheless an important one. In 330, Constantine, the emperor, decided to move the capital from Rome to Byzantium. And then, of course, he changed the name to Constantinople, because if you're emperor, you can do that. It's now Istanbul. So it is in Turkey. He moved it 1,000 miles to the east. Well, what does that do when you're leaving to the east? It leaves the west much more open as it was. An important date, December 31st, the last day of the year 406, the Rhine freezes, and the Rhine at the border with Germany, they're not exactly sure where, but around Cologne or a little north, it froze. It allowed the barbarians, the Germanic tribes, the barbarians to come across, and 20,000 were killed on that day, but they broke through. The Roman army couldn't stop them. That was a key date in the invasion into the Scandinavian end. They were coming down from the north, so a lot of parts were falling. The sack of Rome was a couple years later, and that was in 410. And what happened then, which is interesting, is Alaric, the king of the Visigoths, after they won, he said, we're not going to kill anymore, the killing's done, but we're taking your stuff and we're knocking down all your buildings, including the libraries and everything there. So we're taking over. Those who could left, but the others were now under a different regime. And then North Africa was invaded in 430. That's important because that's the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. And then 476, the death of the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. So he was the last one. And that foundation of Western civilization that we talk about, so critical was it, were the libraries, so critical to it. And there were libraries, and the literature was copied, and that was a key part, and that was being sacked and destroyed, and that's a part, as we'll see later, of what the Irish did to help save civilization. Why the fall? It's hard. This is a big issue. You have a 1,000-year reign that's dropping, so it's hard to put just a couple of points, but these are the big ones. Fewer were paying taxes. It was very onerous taxes. The middle class was hollowed out. The rich weren't always paying, and so there were fewer taxes there. Overextended military. The military, very professional and well-known, the Roman Legion. Well, by now, over half of the folks in the military were slaves and serfs and mercenaries. So they weren't the professionals. The others weren't being paid or paid as much. So you're overextended, your military isn't strong, so therefore you're getting beaten. Corruption and instability. One example, in one 75-year period, they had 20 emperors. So there's a lot of instability inside. And then, of course, comes the lawlessness, and then finally the barbarian invasions. And those came from many different directions. I mentioned North Africa, coming down from Scandinavia, coming from the east across what is now Germany. So they were getting it from all sides. And like a rotted tree that doesn't fall right away, even though it's dead, once these pressures came, as we're in the early 5th century, it fell, and it fell quickly. So now we'll look at Patrick, and I think it's important just because this is the part of the culture that he is born into and he is a part of. Born 385 in Britain. Now, where in Britain? The consensus is what is now Wales, Western Britain. Others are on Scotland. Beth and I were on a land tour in the UK. Our guide was Welsh. You know where he said St. Pat came from and is. But that is the consensus of what is now Wales in West Britain. His dad was a revenue collector for the Romans. Remember, this is the far end of the Roman Empire. He was a deacon in the church. His grandfather was a priest. This is several centuries before the church made celibacy a requirement for priests. But he was, Patrick, by his own definition, not a very strong believer. As T.M. Moore, who's the head of the Fellowship of the Alba and wrote The Legacy of Patrick, put it, he was a nominal Christian in a nominal church and a nominal Roman society. Now, he's also at this time, we're talking about 401s, 15, 16-year-olds. Anyone who has 16-year-old boys, I think knucklehead goes with it. The reason I say that, in these outposts, very violent, these towns stayed together. You didn't wander far because you wanted to be safe. Well, Patrick and his buddies decided to wander who knows what they were wandering for as 15 or 16-year-olds, but they were kidnapped in 401 by slave traders. And that's one, as we'll see, of the professions and businesses that Ireland was good at, was slave trading. And he was taken back to Ireland. Again, this is one of these issues exactly where, based on his writings, and we'll see some, it certainly points to it, that Wood of Vaucluse, which is a County Mayo now, and it is the end of civilization as far as Europe is concerned, because there's nothing between it and North America, as you see on that western part. And he was taken there as a slave for 6 years. He was a shepherd. And that sounds kind of nice when you think of quaint shepherd. He was not, and mostly alone. You can imagine, if you've been to Ireland, you can imagine the winters there, the wind and the darkness. Very little human interaction with his owner a little bit, but that was it. But for 6 years, he was there. And it's interesting, I mentioned it, his nominal relationship with God at that point of a teenager, but as you can imagine, when you're at the very bottom of your life, you start wondering if there's something more, if there's some help. And he began connecting with God through prayer, and he wrote in his confession, "And there the Lord opened the sense of my unbelief, that I might at last remember my sins and be converted with all my heart to the Lord my God, who had regard for my abjection and mercy on my youth and ignorance, and watched over me before I knew him, and before I was able to distinguish between good and evil, and guarded me and comforted me, as would a father his son." So it's interesting, no Bible, of course, no teachers, but praying constantly with God. And he felt that connection. Remember, this is 6 years in this desolate condition. And he wrote in confession, his autobiography, "But after I came to Ireland, every day I had to tend sheep, and many times a day I prayed. The love of God and his fear came to me more and more, and my faith was strengthened, and my spirit was moved, so that in a single day I would say as many as 100 prayers, and almost as many in the night. And this even when I was staying in the woods and the mountains. And I used to get up for prayer before daylight, through snow, through frost, through rain, and I felt no harm, and there was no sloth in me, as I now see, because the spirit within me was fervent." So he spent months at a time without even connecting with humans at that time. He was, you can imagine, very hungry. And he had, though, a vision. And he had a vision of God telling him to escape. Well, the upside of being a shepherd with no one around is you can leave. The downside, you remember where it was, and he had the call to leave, and he did. And he walked about 200 miles to the east, where he was able to get on a ship, talked his way onto it, and he took it to Gaul, that's France now, where he was sold as a slave again. But he had a vision and a word from God that he would only be a slave for 6 months, and that's what happened. And he escaped and then went back to Britain. Can you imagine your son has been gone 6 years? You knew where he went because this thing happened. Slave traders came, you knew, and that you would never see him again. And here he comes back after walking that whole way. And of course they were elated, as you can imagine, reunited with family and friends. But there's a but, and the but is he was called by God to go back to Ireland. And as you can imagine, the response from the family and friends was certainly not one in which they encouraged that. And he decided, though, that that was what he was going to do. And he felt he was called, and he was going to go back there. He got some of his inheritance, not a lot, but some, and he went by himself back to Ireland. Exactly when, one of those issues. Certainly it's either in the 420s or early 430s. Where exactly he went, we're not sure, although as we'll see, the vision that he says he saw. And this is sitting in his comfort in Britain. He saw in night the vision of a man whose name, Victoricus, coming as it were from Ireland with countless letters, and he gave me one of them, and I read the opening words of the letter, which were the voice of the Irish, and as I read the beginning of the letter, I thought that at the same moment I heard their voice, they were there besides the wood of Folclute, which is near the western sea, and thus did they cry out as with one mouth, "We, as you, boy, come and walk among us once more." And he decided to, therefore, go back. I think it's important now to see where he was going. Remember, the Roman Empire had no interest in Ireland, and there was a reason they didn't. It was settled in 600 BC. Thomas Cahill, in How the Irish Saved Civilization, called it an illiterate, aristocratic, semi-nomadic, Iron Age warrior culture. It was a confederacy of kings in name only. They were really chieftains at that setup at that time. There were no real cities. There were just these areas that the chieftains were over. It is horribly uncivilized. They still had human sacrifice. They sacrificed to the gods of war with the POWs, newborns to the harvest gods. It was a truly, deeply pagan, violent civilization that he was going back to. It was never part of the Roman Empire. There was no record of any writing or reading in Ireland at that time. Their key domestic and foreign policy, raiding and slaving. That's what they did. So Patrick is going back. Now, exactly where he was called in that vision back to Folclute, but did he go there? We don't know exactly. Different folks have different ideas, but the key was he went back. And can you imagine, you've been there for 6 years as a slave, you know where you're going back to, you know what it's like, and this is what he wrote. "Daily I expect murder, fraud, or captivity, or whatever it may be, but I fear none of these things because of the promises of heaven. I've cast myself into the hands of God Almighty, who rules everywhere. As the prophet says, cast your thought upon God, and he shall sustain you." There was, and it's interesting, he connected with some groups of Christians. We don't know who went to Ireland as a missionary before, but there were small pockets of Christians, and he connected with them and then built those groups and the priests and became a bishop. And it spread in his lifetime to the west, the north, and the east, and the central, not to the south, not to Munster. That was about a generation after he died. They stayed pagan, but the rest of Ireland in his lifetime did. And it is fascinating to see in this environment the kind of accomplishments he has. Obviously, sharing the gospel of Christ, preached throughout Ireland. Thousands were converted to the saving faith, changing that culture. He taught people to read, introduced writing to the island. That had not been done, so that came along with the church and his faith. He trains thousands of men and women. That's important. Women were in leadership positions within the church, and he planted hundreds of congregations in all except the southern part during his lifetime. And he laid the foundation for a season of revival and Christian vitality. It's called the Celtic Revival, and we'll get into that in a little bit. He nurtured Irish scholarship. The first Irish Christians were the first literate Irish. And he abolished the slave trade. And he is the first known leader to do so. Now, there was still slavery in Ireland, especially in the southern part, but he abolished the slave trade. That's what kind of influence he had at that time. Now, I think at this time it's a good point to go back to the asterisk at the beginning and talk about Patrick and the Roman Catholic connection. So a couple hundred years after he died was the Synod at Whitby. It's first of many, and it was the attempt to meld the Roman Catholic and Celtic Christianity, and we'll see how much Celtic Christianity had grown away from Ireland and the UK into Europe even. So it was a force there, as was the Eastern Church. So this was part of how to get them together. The first issue, the biggest issue, the synod they put together was, when do we celebrate Easter? That was the issue on the table, but there was a difference between there. But after the 8th century, Patrick is tied to the Roman Catholic Church. And I mentioned Cahill, and I'll share some quotes from his book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. And even he just states it as a fact that he went to a Catholic monastery off the coast of France and was trained there for years and then sent by the Pope to Ireland. I would think if you wrote an autobiography of your life in the spirit that you'd include that part, and it's not part of his confession. It's not part of it. But by the 12th century, Celtic Christianity was fully absorbed into the Roman Catholic Church, and in all sorts of ways, and that included Patrick. And he was made a saint, because the way they did it then, the locals would say this person deserves sainthood, and the bishop would look and agree, and you were a saint. Well, we know now the process is a lot more arduous. Then we have the Celtic revival. It really went from 430, when he was part of his ministry, till the end of the 9th century, till about 800. And Iona's an important part of this revival and its impact. And it's really Columcille, also known as Columba. He was a disciple of Patrick, and he was one of the leaders there, and he started, really he was the first missionary, so going from Ireland to Iona, which is that part of Scotland, way on the end. And if you've ever gone around Scotland, it's a tough place there, but that's where he went. And he was part of what are called the Peregrini, those that went out, these Irish Christians in white martyrdom. They would get together on the ships, and away they'd go, never to be seen again. But many having the impact in Europe, because that's where they were going to. And he was really the first one in setting up the monasteries and the communities. And again, Patrick did in Ireland as well. And Columcille in Iona there set up the communities, and in Scotland that spread throughout that area. And they are communities that obviously teaching the Bible and studying, but also working and being together, supporting each other, protecting each other. Those were those communities there. And they had a little rule, which was after 120 monks were trained, 12 would head out. It's kind of like that idea in some Sunday schools. You know, once you get to 60, we're cutting and splitting you up because we want you to keep spreading. That's probably where it came from. So after you hit 120, 12 headed out. But he set up, under his leadership, 60 within Scotland in that time. So he was one who was setting up those communities and monastic communities. And here's one from Ireland, St. Bawdon's monastic settlement, and this is in Culdath in the 8th century, a painting about it. But that idea of the folks together and living together and being together. And another one is Columbanus, and this was after Patrick died, but he is very famous for his work. And he headed out, he was called, again, part of those going out into the sea, into Gaul, which is France, and he clashed immediately. He was quite a personality, because he ran into the local bishops who were part of the church and said, "You're all tied in with the aristocracy. Where is your Christian outreach to the poor? What are you doing?" He was not well received, and he was thrown out. So he went to Italy, and by now, go right to the teeth of it. And he started the first Italo-Irish monastery, and in his late 60s, he literally helped build it. And he took on a couple of popes, writing to them, and not physically, but writing to them and challenging their view of Christ. So he was pretty cantankerous, but he was quite a leader. He founded between 60 and 100 monasteries in France, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. It's an amazing story of, and he's a lot of writings about his evangelical output and what people should do and how they should live for Christ. And again, he was a key part of this Celtic revival that was going on, as you see, now well into Europe, that came out of Ireland. And some examples when we look at artistic forms that we see today. For example, you've heard the breastplates, and that's a new verse form that came through. And we've heard the breastplate of St. Patrick. He didn't write, it was an anonymous writer much later, but it was a different writing of that type. The carved crosses, and we've seen those, and you think of the pagan culture, for example, Stonehenge, making these stones that connect between us and their gods. That was the thinking about it. And what's interesting is the missionaries instead would teach, as they were spreading Christianity, saying Christ is that connection between us and God, the one true God. And so they used what the pagans were used to using, which is stones and monuments, and saying, this is how we are going to connect. And obviously those are very different than the Roman crucifixes and that sort, and those are still around. And then the illustrated manuscripts, the best known is the Book of Kells, and it is the four Gospels. Yes, it was an evangelical going forth for Christ, but also these parts of culture that tied, especially for art, and what a difference that made. So around us now, as the Celtic revival is going on, Roman Empire is absolutely collapsing. And so this comes to that idea of, how could you say the Irish saved civilization, or what was their part of it? Well, by the end of the 5th century, the western part has collapsed. It's gone through no emperor, and the barbarians not are only at the gates, the barbarians have crashed through, and they're in control at that time. All the great libraries have been destroyed. They've been sacked all throughout Europe. Also, few copyists are left, because that was a whole job that you would have as a copyist, because they were taking literature and copying them for their own culture, and that's how it was done. Well, now we're a generation through, there very few are doing it. But the Irish monks are furiously copying, and they started that in Ireland. As they would get the material from Europe, they would copy, and that was one of their calls, to copy, and had been doing that for generations. So everything's getting destroyed in the West, but in Ireland and in the monasteries as they moved, that was one of their calls there. And Cahill, who wrote the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, as he put it, these scribes then served as conduits through which the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian cultures were transmitted to the tribes of Europe. Newly settled amid the rubble and ruined vineyards of the civilization they had overwhelmed. This is the book, and they have it here in the library, by the way. And as he said, for he, being Patrick, had transmitted their pagan virtue of loyalty, courage, and generosity into the Christian equivalents of faith, hope, and charity. And again, this is a secular historian who's simply looking at what this man did as he made the difference. Christianity, which transformed Ireland into something new, something never seen before, a Christian culture where slavery and human sacrifice became unthinkable, and warfare, though impossible for humans to eradicate, diminished markedly. I thought it was interesting too, and I think it adds weight when you have secular historians confirming the impact of Christians, and one was such, James Westfall Thompson, says the weight of the Irish influence on the continent is incalculable. And Cahill, as he talked about it, basically did the book saying, as he looked through it, saying, why didn't anybody mentioning this? And again, we can blame it on how people look at Irish, perhaps. But then Cahill said they brought the books, and this is coming from Ireland, so they weren't just copying, they were then bringing the books, many unseen in Europe for centuries, tied to their waist as a sign of triumph. In the bays and valleys of their exile, they reestablished literacy, breathed new life into the exhausted literary culture of Europe, and that, as he says, is how the Irish saved civilization. So it's an impact of a man we celebrate and have fun with, but also had an impact on us even today. And have a couple of books I mentioned, How the Irish Saved Civilization, The Confession of St. Patrick, and Legacy of Patrick I mentioned. And also the Fellowship of the Alba, that's the Celtic Christian group that I'm part of, has wonderful information about that as well. So I think it's a fascinating story of a fascinating man who had such an important impact on how we live today.